So it's live.
So today I wanted to discuss the neural correlates of spiritual consciousness. And to make it simple, the idea is that spiritual consciousness does exist. Different altered states of consciousness are available to all of us. But although these altered states of consciousness are available to all of us, whatever states of consciousness you have are reflected in the brain. So this is not an attempt to be a reductionist, to be a materialist and say everything is, due to material changes that occur in the brain, and there's nothing spiritual. I'm just trying to show you that very often, along with the spiritual experiences that one has, parallel to that, correlated to it, there are certain changes that occur, and the neuroscience of those changes, we call them as neural correlates because they are correlated with the spiritual experience. So I thought I'll just generally talk about it because I have a lot of experience in this field. And a lot of this experience developed because besides being interested in spirituality and spiritual science, I was also very interested in, I am rather a surgeon by profession, and I wanted to look at it from a pure science perspective. And towards that end, I even taught a course in mind and body medicine and did extensive experimentation on different techniques using technology for attaining altered states of consciousness, including mind machines, various other forms of entrainment, neuro-linguistic programming. I also met and discussed with people who are doing radio imaging of people engaged in meditation. The idea being that I should have a holistic perspective on both sides of what is happening inside us at the same time as what appears to be happening inside of us when we look at the material picture. So let me start with the very simple things and something which everybody can experience. And it has been used as a technology by prophets in the past. Everyone has heard of prophets who go into the desert, they go into a cave where they fast for large number of days, and after fasting for large number of days and also being in isolation, they get a vision of God or the devil or perhaps both, and then they come to certain realizations which they bring back to the people who are their devotees. So what is it that helps to attain these altered states of consciousness which have been experienced by prophets? And do you think that you can experience them? Perhaps many of you have experienced them. And there are three primary known causative factors for generating altered states of consciousness. The first one is called sensorial deprivation. By sensorial deprivation, we mean that our five senses, the sense of touch, the sense of sight, the sense of hearing, the sense of smell, the sense of taste, all of these are starved. And when you are deprived the stimulation of the senses, something strange happens to the brain and it flips you into an altered state of consciousness. One example, of course, well known since time immemorial, is being placed in a chamber where you're sensorially deprived. The chamber is completely dark, your eyes are blindfolded, your sense of hearing is shut off with probably some kind of headphones that cut off the sound. You are starved of all these other senses as well. And when you're deprived of all the senses, something begins to change inside of you. The same thing happens when you're socially deprived. While there is a lot to be said for association with saintly people or association with like-minded, spiritually oriented people, which is known as Sat Sang, there is also even more to be said for what we call as social isolation. In the Bhagavad-Geeta, this is recommended towards a conclusion, where he says, Vivikta Desha Sevitvam Jana Arate Samshadi. That when you live in an isolated place apart from the general mass of people, general mass of worldly minded people. And of course, the third is caloric deprivation. So if you are eating well, chances of going into an altered state of consciousness are considerably diminished. But when you are fasting, this phenomenon of fasting also weakens the senses and the body and makes you more receptive to an altered state of consciousness. So to give you an idea, when all these three are combined, it really becomes a great launching pad for an altered state of consciousness. So, one, to be sensorially deprived. Two, to be socially restricted or isolated. And lastly, to have caloric restriction. And it's not surprising that when you go for meditational retreats, when you retreat from the world to undergo a period of contemplation, introspection, regardless of the faith, you are deprived calorically. You are not encouraged to have social contact And also, you are encouraged to be sensorially deprived. It even works when it is not voluntary. For example, prisoners who are especially violent or difficult to control are classically put into what we call as solitary confinement. In solitary confinement, they're put into a cell where there is very little light or any other sensorial stimulation. They're given tasteless, bland food, just enough to keep them going, and they are totally isolated from everybody. And having been placed in solitary confinement for a period of time, the longer the better, not just 10 days or 15 days, which might be good enough for many people. But especially if you are put in solitary confinement for 2 or 3 months, when you come out of that solitary confinement, the prisoners who were so violent, so aggressive, they come out like saintly lambs. They come out like saintly lambs. Therefore, it's important for us to understand that sensorial deprivation, social isolation, and caloric restriction. When these three are done together, your spiritual retreats, your spiritual adventures are more likely to succeed because you are more likely to be put into an altered state of consciousness. Typically, if any of you have attended, and of course I'm speaking from Bombay, but there are many meditational retreats that are conducted. At one time, I used to conduct meditational retreats regularly during the year, and I would teach roughly 8 different forms of meditation over 8 hours and do this over 2 or 3 days. The idea being you could choose the meditation that works for you and you could carry it back with you. But there also we used these 3 techniques of social isolation, caloric restriction, sensorial deprivation. And you will see this used in other spiritual retreats as well. And some of these meditations, they refuse to teach them outside of the retreat. A good example is Vipassana. In Vipassana, you have to submit yourself to sensorial deprivation, social isolation, and caloric restriction for 10 days. Otherwise, they will not teach you. That's how you begin. And how much of it is due to the triple requirements of sensorial deprivation, caloric restriction, social isolation, and how much of it is due to the meditational technique remains to be seen. But certainly, the combination of all of these with a meditational technique work wonderfully. So, a lot of biochemical changes occur within us, and it is well established now that the sense of self is formed as a social construct. For we are not one self, but we are the combination of many selves. We are not just individuals, but we are mothers and fathers. We are children. We are brothers and sisters. And thus different roles that we play are all the different senses of self that we have. And these different selves that we have coalesce to form a more composite self, which we think of as I, me, and myself. And therefore, social isolation works very well. And your social isolation weakens the sense of self. Similarly, as I've been recommending here in these sessions, chanting works wonderfully because chanting also creates a vibration within the body and it creates a task positive network within your brain. It activates a task positive circuit within your brain and thus weakens the sense of self even further. And when you have caloric restriction added to it, automatically what happens is that you become more and more likely to trip into a state of consciousness that you would never have when you live in everyday life in society. Over the years, many people have been considered spiritual and holy. They've had divine visions. They've seen lights and heard sounds. And they've gone automatically into trances. They've gone into trance. And what is this? What is the correlate of this? What is the neural correlate of this? And a typical neural correlate of many of these people is epilepsy. What kind of epilepsy? It's usually a temporal lobe epilepsy, which often is accompanied by religious visions, divine visions, lights, sounds, sometimes God speaking to them when they're having this epileptic fit. The going into trance, which is triggered by some religious or spiritual symbol. For example, for Krishna devotees, seeing a peacock feather may put the epileptic into a fit of unconsciousness, which is seen as trance. So these are some of the conditions which are often construed or interpreted as being highly religious or being, shall we say, highly spiritual. I also explained to you that, one can attain these states through one's self-effort, which I have pointed out. And a lot of these altered states of consciousness result from the loss of sense of self, whether it is a temporary loss of sense of self or whether it's a gross and permanent loss of sense of self. But you need to understand that this loss of sense of self also occurs naturally. It is part of God's defense mechanism to help to cushion you from the disasters you might face in life. So when you have gone through deep loss, deep trouble, deep persecution, deep opposition, especially when your sense of self itself is threatened by what is going on, one enters into a state which is known as depersonalization or derealization. So what is depersonalization and what is derealization? When there is loss of the sense of self, what happens is that God puts you into the back seat as an observer of what is happening. You become transformed naturally into what we call as Sakshi Bhav. You see everything from a back seat. You see it from a distance. You see it from becoming completely detached from what is going on in the world. And not only do you see it as being completely detached from what is going on in the world, you see yourself, and you see yourself having thoughts, and you see yourself acting in the world. And you often think, am I going mad? But one thing occurs in depersonalization. And one thing that occurs in depersonalization, which is protective for you, is that it results in your being unaffected by the world. I say this is a part of a spiritual experience because this is described in the Bhagavad-Geeta. Dukheshu anudignamana sukheshu vigataspriya vitaraga bhaya krodha sthiti mani uchyate. Krishna points out to Arjuna that when you are not disturbed or when you are not depressed by cause for sorrow, when you are not excited by cause for joy, you are free from attachment, fear, and anger. Such is the stage of steady wisdom. And indeed, this is one of the states that we seek. We seek to go through the world unaffected by the world, and yet being able to act and fulfill all our duties in a spirit of renunciation and devotion to the all-pervading Lord. Bhagavad-Gita states, Yataha pravrittir bhutanam yena sarvam idam tatam swakarmana abhyarchaya siddhim nidhi manavata. When we are able to perform our God-given duties in a spirit of sacrifice and devotion to the all-pervading Lord, we attain peace, perfection, and the supreme destination. So, this is the goal of Bhagavad Gita. This is the end point that we aspire to reach. Not that there is an end point, because the path to spirituality and the worship of God is unending, Svanantam. And following the attainment of moksha, which we are talking about now, one also attains what is known as parabhakti, or continuous acts of devotion to God. But depersonalization resulting in a complete detachment from the world, having a sense of being an observer, immune to all reactive emotions and the provocations from the external environment, one remains in this altered state of consciousness. In the sixth chapter also, Krishna says that Jitatmana Prashantasya Paramatma Samhita Sitoshana Sukha Dukheshu Tata Manapanayo. For one who has conquered his mind, for him God is already reached. For him, heat or cold, joy or sorrow, honor and dishonor, they are all the same. It is Sama Lostrashma Kanchanaha. One sees a piece of gold and he sees a rock with equal emotional vision. Indeed, Surin Mitrari Udasina Madhyastha Dvesha Bandhushu Sadhushva Apicha Papeshu Sama Buddhir Vishishyate. Yes, indeed. You look upon friend, enemy, mediator, saint, sinner with equal vision. So this is an altered state of consciousness which Bhagavad Gita leads us towards. There are many ways to attain this. I am talking about the Bhagavad Gita because the Bhagavad Gita is the safe way. It is possible to attain a certain degree of depersonalization through the use of both psychopharmacology or the use of drugs, It's also possible to get some visions by the use of electromagnetic stimulation. And let me tell you a little bit about both. So first and foremost, if you type depersonalization in your uh, Google and you click on, let us say, videos, you will get a whole host of videos of people who have tripped into this altered state of consciousness. And they've tripped into this altered state of consciousness as a result of taking various drugs. Some have taken LSD, some have taken marijuana, some have taken other drugs. But having taken these drugs without desiring to enter into depersonalization, they have tripped into it and now they feel trapped because they are not able to enjoy the world the way they could when they were worldly minded. So here they had lost because they've been thrown into an altered state of consciousness where they are in Sakshi Bhav, but they don't want that Sakshi Bhav. They want to get involved in the world. And this is a very disturbing state, which is why psychiatrists call it depersonalization disorder. That is not what we seek. What we seek really is, we seek consciousness of God. Yes, we want to forget self, but we want to remember God as a means to forget self. We want to remember God and we want to see Him everywhere. We want to Yo mam pashyati sarvatra sarvam cha mai pashyati tasyaham na pranashyami socha me na pranashyati. Indeed, if you can see God in all things and all things in God, then such a person, Krishna says, is never lost to him, nor is he ever lost to me. So, it's important to see God everywhere. It is important to do everything for God. Yat karoshi yad ashnasi, yat johosi dadasi, yat tapasyasi kaunteya tat purusham adarpana. The problem is that if you do not use God, depend on God, rest at the feet of God, surrender to Him, act for Him in the performance of your God-given duties, then your mind becomes a hell. And a mind without a sense of self can become an even worse sense of hell. So the solution is to remember God and then use that remembrance of God to naturally forget the self. Not to use drugs or chemicals or other things which could cause trouble or suffering to you, in fact, in great measure. But there are people who are using drugs medically and scientifically, and they're actually using, shall we say, an extract of peyote or mushroom, magic mushroom, which is known as psilocybin. And psilocybin is being used for people who have been diagnosed to have a fatal illness and who are dying of that illness in a short time. They don't have much time for meditation or much time for any other activities. And while they are close to death, they're also in deep depression. So there are scientific trials that are going on using psilocybin capsules to bring about this altered state of consciousness, to put them in the state of Sakshi Bhava, to make them detached from the world, and to give them that peace of mind which they need when they're approaching swiftly coming death. As I explained to you about epilepsy, and if you look back in our history books, you will find so many people who have now in retrospect been people who have probably been victim of such illnesses, including, shall we say, I've written an article on Paul of Tarsus. The issue really is that we can use electrical and magnetic stimulation. And there's a Canadian professor by the name of Michael Persinger, who with the assistance of Koren has made what is known as a God helmet. This God helmet is like a regular motorcycle helmet with some modifications. And when you put on this helmet, you become, of course, sensorially deprived. But at the same time, a magnetic field is created around your brain with that God helmet. And inevitably, most people who go through this experience actually have a religious vision. They have spiritual vision. They even have, a sense that there is somebody there with them. Even the most atheistical of them feel that they are in the presence of somebody. And of course, this is the reason for what we call as Bhoot Bangla and, ghost houses and haunted places. There's certain magnetic fields in those areas which give you the impression that there is someone there. So your brain is strongly influenced by these magnetic forces. Even the use of entrainment is very helpful in creating altered states of consciousness. And I have extensively used both visual as well as auditory entrainment using various devices now known as mind machines. And then I've used mixers, and with mixers put on shlokas and chanting and so many other things, and use neuro-linguistic programming, which I'm trained in, and hypnosis with these, in order to create altered states of consciousness and treat therapeutically, look after people who have a specific problem. But I would like all of you to understand that while all these states are attainable through various devices or by psychopharmacology, the method used by the Bhagavad-Geeta is by far the safest and also the most effective. And I can also guarantee you that it will work. That if you are able to chant 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening of the Hare Krishna, Hare Rama Maha Mantra, that is, if you are able to do 32 malas a day, 16 in the morning, 16 in the evening, offer everything that you do to God with the idea Om Tat Sat. O Lord Krishna, this is an offering to you. That whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer, whatever you give away, whatever austerities, whatever work you perform, everything you do it for Krishna. If you restrict all your other activities and center your life around Krishna, you will naturally and effortlessly, without any disturbance of mind, be situated in a state of complete absorption in God. And also, you will become invulnerable, or at least as you progress, you will become less and less affected by the ups and downs that you come across in the world. So if you want to become, as I said in life, some pain is inevitable because birth, death, old age, disease, they're natural. But suffering is an option. Oh, why me? Why did I have to suffer like this? Look at this other guy, he's doing well. Look at that. I wish I was young again. All that is suffering. So some pain is inevitable, but suffering is an option. And living your life as the Bhagavad-Gita directs is the means by which you can truly transcend suffering by absorbing yourself in God and forgetting the sense of self. So I will pause here. If anyone has any questions, they are free to ask me.
Good morning, sir. So I'll start with the first question. So can we say that spirituality is a deeper science which has always been there and exists in another form, but we can't only experience it through our physical senses, just like the rest of the 95% of the universe. And our holy books and our religion teach us.
Too long a question, and I can't see you.
Am I not visible?
No. And keep the question short so I can answer appropriate.
Sure, sir. I don't know why the camera is not.
Okay, just tell me.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question, sir. So can we
No,
say
don't
that?
repeat it. You just summarize it and tell me, please.
Okay. So can we say that spirituality is a deeper science that exists in some different form, and we cannot experience it just through our physical senses? And our holy books or our religion teach us to get deeper into that science.
Yes, of course, spirituality is a very deep science and it transcends everything that we can see, smell, hear, taste, and touch. But as I've pointed out, although you may be having spiritual experiences, there are certain neural correlates or there are certain correlations in your mind, in your brain, which result from those deeper spiritual experiences. And that is what I've tried to cover to some extent today.
Sure, sir. So with that, moving to another question. So why we were talking about the solitary confinement, but instead of as a reformative activity, it's usually used as a punishment, and the effects that are seen on the people who were given the solitary confinement, they were quite different than as we expect in a spiritual reform activity.
See, it's not just in a prison that they use solitary confinement. You can go to a monastery, and in the monastery, the monks shut themselves voluntarily into a place of solitary confinement. So they are sometimes lowered into caves where no one is there to hear them or speak to them except at meal times or to remove their products of evacuation. So there are, it's not used as a punishment, it is used as a reformatory process. But Bhagavad-Gita does not depend on all these, because to do all these things will demand that you give up your duties and responsibilities and your work, which is the last thing that Bhagavad-Gita wants you to do. Therefore, the Bhagavad-Gita tells you that you will get the same effects by remembering God with an intensity that helps you to forget yourself.
But so the vibration at a prison and at a monastery is completely different. And the
So
person who
that's what I'm trying
voluntarily.
to tell you. What I'm trying to say is you don't need that. You don't need that. You don't have to have that if you're following the principles of the Bhagavad Gita. Because similar states of consciousness are attainable by acting for God and not for self.
Sure.
By making your life into a meditation, you don't need to go into a monastery.
Definitely so. So, sir, these were our questions for today. And thank you so much for such an amazing session. And so we will see you next week. Thank you so much.
Jai Shri Krishna, Hare Krishna, Hari Om.
Jai Shri Krishna, sir. Thank you so much.